first to COVID-19 and the economic question. We've seen the national accounts figures today. We know that they're pretty frightening. But what do they actually mean? With me once again is Andrew Stone to help explain these things. Andrew, welcome back to Watercooler.
Thanks, Nick. Pleasure to be here.
Now, the figures aren't great, I suppose, to put it mildly, but how much can we read into them at this stage?
Well, I guess, Nick, I find myself in a strange position for an economist that I don't think it's a useful exercise even to be particularly looking at the details of these figures. There are really two things that stand out to me at the current juncture in relation to our policy response to the Wuhan virus and what's going on with the economy. One is that the economic damage is severe, and that's what we've seen in the national accounts. We've had a huge drop in gross domestic product, in output. So that's one factor. It really doesn't matter, is it 5%, 10%? It's an enormous fall. And the second point is that it's the result of the policy response to the virus, not the virus itself. And so my take is we have this situation where, in my view, the policy response is massively, massively out of kilter with where we should be on either an economic or health grounds in terms of the trade-offs that we need to consider. So we have a situation where we have massive economic and other damage being inflicted, a policy response that isn't even remotely in the right ballpark. And so it's not a useful exercise actually to spend very long analysing the details of this and trying to say which particular parts of the economy were particularly badly hit. Usually that is a useful exercise. In normal times, if the economy suffers a slight contraction or if growth isn't as strong as you thought, it can be useful to see, was this a result of weak consumer demand? Was it because businesses weren't investing as much as we'd like? Because then, first of all, businesses can draw information from that and figure out what's the right way to respond. And policymakers also can think, are there tweaks we need to make? Are there incentives that it would be worth providing? Are there other changes we should be making to make life easier for the business community? But none of that applies here because we're so far off from any sensible policy response. So my take would be, these figures show that we've got things horribly wrong. We now need to move the 98% of the way back to a common sense response here, which will remove the overwhelming majority of the restrictions that we have on economic activity and on personal activity everywhere, including in Victoria. And then we can get to the point of discussing the fine detail and what's the right thing to tweak the last few percent to get things to optimise things.
Yeah, and of course we should always remember that what we're looking at here are the figures for the June quarter, so up to June 30, before the Andrews government woke up to what was happening in Victoria and put that ridiculously over the top, in my view, lockdown in place, which has created tremendous additional damage.
Yeah.
Obviously in Victoria, right, but I'm interested to know the border closures, and not just the border closures with Victoria, but the border closures between Queensland and New South Wales, between South Australia and New South Wales, between Western Australia and the entire world, it seems to me. Do we know what that does to the economy when we sort of basically chop one of the arteries of the economy?
Yeah. Again, it would be possible to examine this in detail, sector by sector, and try to analyse those costs. I don't think, again, that's necessarily a particularly useful thing to do because bottom line is we know the costs are very significant. There are obviously many different avenues through which that occurs. First of all, there are lots of workers who can't get to where jobs are, even jobs that they used to be doing. So there are the people who now can't do jobs interstate because it's too expensive for them to do that if they now have to go into quarantine arrangements, even if they're allowed to cross borders. There are situations where businesses will be shut down or they'll be operating at well below capacity because, for example, they have specialised equipment that needs to be serviced, and in our highly specialised modern economy, that servicing maybe is done if you might be a manufacturing firm in Victoria, and that servicing is done by a company in New South Wales that specialises in this, and you can't suddenly produce other people to do that servicing. So maybe you're not running your equipment and you've laid off your staff. There are all the people in border areas. If you live in Albury-Wodonga or wherever, then you'll find if you had a little local business there, half your customers were on the other side of the border, and they now can't make it across to, or equally you can't go across to them. Now, you'll get some sorting out there. So the people who used to do the jobs in Victoria will now pick up the clients who in Victoria who used to be serviced by the people on the other side of the border. But it all throws sand in the gears. There are all the tourism operators and so forth now. And then you might say again, maybe Queenslanders will stay in Queensland and support Queensland tourism providers. But after all, if you live in a warm climate on the beach, maybe you don't want to go and have your holiday in a warm climate on the beach. Maybe you wanted to go to the snow, while all those Victorians wanted to come up from the snow to get some warmth in the middle of winter. So you get all of these different avenues. Trying to figure out the exact magnitude of each of those and what the damage is, though, I don't think is, again, a worthwhile exercise, because to me, the whole issue of closing borders is a totally wrong-headed response here. The core point here is that the clinical evidence is now clear on the exact threat that this virus poses, and it makes clear that the whole idea of closing borders and having lockdowns has been completely wrong-headed. And again, a point I always come back to is there's no end game that has been specified here. What is the end game if we're going to try this approach of trying to stamp out every time that we get some new cases here? Are we going to have a situation where for 10 years we're not going to have overseas travel? Are we going to have situations where every time half a dozen cases occur in a state, we shut the borders with that state? That's not a long-term tenable proposition. And you might say it's long-term tenable if we were talking about something like the bubonic plague, but we're not.
Well,
the dangers here do not remotely justify that level of reaction.
Well, let's push that point, and let me force you to take on the really hard-headed economic approach, which I know isn't you. You're naturally not a man who looks at things through such a lens, but we talk about the economic, the value of a life, and economists sit down and calculate this, and they say, well, the value of a life of somebody, say, 85 is less than the value of a life of somebody aged 20, and because they're not, they've got fewer years ahead of them and fewer productive years and so forth. But we do have to make those calculations, don't we, as between, say, the bubonic, between the Spanish flu, which tended to kill people, in their younger years, often soldiers returning home, between that and today's. There's surely a difference that we have to factor in when we make the trade-offs between public health and the economy.
There is a difference, and it absolutely has to be factored in by policymakers, and it's something that policymakers actually do every single day in the normal course of their policymaking. After all, when people are making decisions about what drugs go on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, or about which particular treatments will be subsidised under Medicare or whatever, they are exactly making these sorts of trade-offs between which is the most effective treatment, how many people will it affect, how many years of productive life do they have left. Now, again, it sounds very distasteful to say this, but oddly enough, I suspect the people who find that least distasteful actually are many older people. Many people who are 70 or 80 are much more sanguine about saying, well, look, I've done very well. Of course, I don't want to have unnecessary risks. I take unnecessary risks myself or have unnecessary risks imposed on me. But I think many of those people have a clear understanding that equally it's crazy to say for them, would be crazy for them to say, look, I'm 80, but I expect everybody else to stop their lives, lots of businesses to be destroyed, lots of people's lives to go under, people unable to keep their friendships, all the mental health problems and so forth, just so as to reduce the already very slim risk that I'm at of catching this virus. So we do have to be hard-headed. I could also just say we have to be hard-headed not just because we look at trade-offs here between economic costs, the business costs and so forth, and the health issues, because the tendency always is to say, but if we save one life, well then won't it all have been worth it? Well, clearly it won't have been, because after all, if you run up, as we are doing, $300 billion of debt, that's going to be hospitals less well funded every year for decades into the future, all sorts of health costs, less drugs on the pharmaceutical benefit scheme and so forth. But not merely are there the future health versus current health trade-off, there are current health versus current health trade-offs in the approach we've taken to this virus. So there are lots of people now who will not have been getting their cancers detected because they've been led to believe by health authorities and by our reckless media often, I think, that the risks are so great they shouldn't go out and take that test at hospital that they should have got. There are enormous mental health problems building up in society, especially among young people, I think, but actually all through society, and particularly also I can imagine lots of business owners who've seen 20 or 30 years of their life's work undone, destroyed in many cases. There are all sorts of these other health effects that will show up. And so even in terms of the trade-off, the health trade-offs alone, leaving aside the economic and other aspects, my own view is that actually even there we've got the trade-off wrong. The idea of putting general society into a lockdown rather than saying, let's take steps to quarantine the sick and also to particularly protect those small cohorts of vulnerable people, especially people in nursing homes. That would be a sensible policy response. General lockdown is not now, never has been, a sensible policy response.
No, and here's the thing, right? Young people are far less prone to die of this, in fact, very unlikely to die of this COVID-19 virus unless they've got some precondition.
Yeah.
Old people are more likely, but who's going to pay for this? Who's going to pay for these 140 billion and counting that we've put directly into this, and the the countless billions, hundreds of billions more that are going to be knocked off GDP for the foreseeable future? Who pays for that? Well, the young people, I think.
Absolutely, it'll be young people, also young people who are now not earning income at the moment, to start getting that deposit on their house to be able to start a family and so forth. They will be bearing those costs. And part of the critical thing here, I think, is to get information, because I'm still actually surprised as I walk around supermarkets, buying groceries for the family or whatever. I'm actually surprised to see the number of young people who are wandering around wearing masks just out in general. You look across at people driving cars, lots of young people wearing masks. And I wonder, are they aware that, to me, as I understand it, the clinical evidence is clear and has been clear since late February, early March, very early stages here, that although this virus is very bad if you're elderly and have serious other conditions, especially a respiratory or heart or a similar other serious condition, for young people, especially healthy young people, this virus is far less deadly, far less harmful than a typical flu. The mortality rate for young people, people under 20, even for people under 50, from this virus in country after country, every country overseas, is far less than a typical flu. So it is insane that we are saying these people must put their lives on hold, they must rack up all this extra debt must be racked up that they will then have to pay for. Their job prospects are put on hold, etc., in response to something that for most people, so there's a vulnerable cohorts, we should be focusing our efforts on trying to protect certain small vulnerable cohorts. But for everybody else, this is not as bad as a flu, and it needs to be said, and I'm sick of trying to sort of say apologetically, oh, well, I understand people don't like these comparisons. It needs to be said bluntly. We are massively overreacting to something that for most people doesn't even rise to the level of the common flu.
Well, Andrew, I can't help noticing behind you a row of that magnificent book, Restoring Hope, that you wrote late last year. A wonderful, incisive analysis of some of the economic challenges that we faced before COVID and probably even so now. I'll just remind people it is available from the Menzies Research Centre. Just go to our website, you can buy it, and perhaps we might even get you to sign one or two if people would like that.
I'd be very happy to if anyone wishes to. Absolutely.
Great. Thanks again, Andrew.
Thanks, Nick.